The day they fired the oldest janitor in the building, almost nobody looked up. People kept typing. Meetings continued. Phones kept ringing. To everyone else, it was just another employee carrying a cardboard box toward the elevator. 48 hours later, the same executives who ignored him were searching every floor of the building, desperately trying to find him, because the quiet old janitor they dismissed without a second thought had just become the most important man in the company. My name is Samuel Brooks. I'm 72 years old, and for 18 years, I cleaned the floors at Ashford Technologies. At least, that's what everyone believed. Every weekday I arrived before sunrise. The lobby was empty. The marble floors reflected the lights above like a still lake. By 8 o'clock, the building came alive. Executives rushed through the revolving doors with expensive coffee in one hand and phones in the other. Most never noticed me. A few nodded politely. Many walked past as though I were invisible. I never took it personally. People rarely notice the person cleaning up behind them. After a while, you stop expecting them to. I had my routine. The lobby first, then the executive offices. Finally, the boardroom on the 22nd floor. That room was always unlocked on Friday evenings. No one ever questioned why I stayed inside longer than anywhere else. They simply assumed the boardroom needed more cleaning. Sometimes, the greatest privilege in a building belongs to the person no one pays attention to. One Tuesday morning, I was polishing the brass nameplates outside the executive offices when two young managers walked past me. One glanced in my direction and laughed. "I've worked here 3 years," he said. "I don't think I've ever heard that old guy speak." The other smiled. "I doubt anyone even knows his name." I kept polishing, not because I hadn't heard them, because I had, and because people often reveal the most about themselves when they believe you're invisible. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Out stepped Victor Langley, the company's chief executive officer. He was 46. Sharp suit, perfect smile, always surrounded by people trying to impress him. He stopped in front of me for the first time in months. "Morning." He hesitated. He didn't know my name. "Morning, sir," I replied. He nodded and continued toward the boardroom without another word. That wasn't unusual. The unusual part came an hour later. Every employee received the same email. Mandatory staff meeting. Attendance required. By 10 o'clock, hundreds of employees filled the auditorium. Victor stood confidently on stage. "Our industry is changing," he announced. "To remain competitive, we have to make difficult decisions." The room became silent. Then came the words nobody wanted to hear. "Today we are reducing our workforce." Names began appearing on the screen behind him. Department after department. One by one. Some people cried. Others simply stared. Then, my name appeared. Samuel Brooks. Facilities. After 18 years, I had exactly 30 minutes to clear out my locker. When the meeting ended, an HR manager escorted me downstairs. She handed me a small envelope. "We appreciate your years of service." I smiled and accepted it. No hard feelings. She seemed surprised by my calmness. "I suppose you saw this coming." I looked around the lobby one last time. At the polished floors. The reception desk. The company logo mounted on the wall. Then I looked back at her. No. I saw something else coming. She frowned. "What do you mean?" I picked up my old key ring, slipped it into my pocket and quietly said, "I hope someone remembers to read the company's original charter." She laughed politely. "I'm not sure what that has to do with anything." Neither was I. The first time I signed it. As the elevator doors closed behind me, one member of the board froze. He had just heard 6 words that hadn't been spoken inside this building for over 30 years. By lunchtime, most people had already forgotten about me. The cleaning cart had been rolled into storage. My locker was empty. Someone else had been assigned to polish the lobby floors. To the employees of Ashford Technologies, Life moved on exactly as it had the day before. But on the 22nd floor, something had changed. The emergency board meeting had barely begun when Director Margaret Ellis closed the conference room door. She looked around the table before speaking. Did anyone else hear what the janitor said this morning? Most of the directors looked confused. Victor Langley leaned back in his chair. You mean the comment about some old charter? Margaret nodded. He didn't say a charter. He said the original charter. The room fell silent. Victor shrugged. So, Margaret replied. The last person I heard use those words was our founder. Victor smiled. Margaret, that document is ancient. It has nothing to do with today's business. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward the company's legal counsel. David, where is the original charter? David adjusted his glasses. It should be in the corporate archive. Should be. We haven't accessed it in years. Victor checked his watch. Can we not waste time chasing paperwork from 35 years ago? David stood. I'll have someone retrieve it. 20 minutes later he returned. Empty-handed. The archive doesn't have it. Victor frowned. What do you mean it doesn't have it? We searched every cabinet. It's gone. For the first time that morning Victor looked concerned. Margaret folded her hands. Who was the last person with unrestricted access to the archive? David opened a folder. According to the access records, only one employee had entered that room every single Friday for the past 18 years. Samuel Brooks. The janitor. Victor laughed. That's impossible. He was cleaning. David slowly shook his head. The security logs show something unusual. He always stayed inside for exactly 23 minutes. Every Friday. Without exception. Margaret looked directly at Victor. How many people even knew that room existed? Very few. Victor stood up. Fine. Call Samuel. David hesitated. I already tried. And he isn't answering. Victor looked irritated. Then send someone to his house. Before anyone could respond, the door opened. A young IT manager stepped inside. Sorry to interrupt, but there's another problem. Victor sighed. What now? The digital archive. We can't access it. Why not? The system says one of the founding authorization files is missing. David frowned. Missing? The file isn't deleted. It simply isn't available. Victor rubbed his forehead. This has to be some kind of software issue. The IT manager swallowed. I thought so too. But every backup shows the same thing. The authorization file hasn't been accessible since. He looked down at his tablet. Since this morning. The exact minute Samuel's employee badge was deactivated. Nobody spoke. Victor finally broke the silence. You're telling me our computer systems are connected to a janitor? I'm saying. The manager chose his words carefully. They're connected to someone with the same employee identification number. The room grew quiet again. Margaret slowly stood. I want every document related to Samuel Brooks. Personnel records. Hiring records. Everything. David nodded. I'll have HR send the file. Less than 10 minutes later, the file arrived. It was surprisingly thin. One employment application. One tax form. Annual performance reviews. Nothing unusual. Until Margaret reached the last page. She stopped reading. Her expression changed completely. Victor noticed. What is it? Without saying a word, Margaret turned the page around and slid it across the table. At the bottom, just above Samuel's signature, was a hiring authorization unlike anything they'd ever seen. It wasn't signed by Human Resources. It wasn't signed by the Facilities Department. It carried only one signature, the founder's. And beneath it, written in blue ink, was a handwritten instruction. Never revoke this employee's access without consulting the original charter. The room fell completely silent. No one at the table remembered seeing that instruction before. But one thing had become painfully clear. Samuel Brooks had never been just a janitor. The board thought they had uncovered Samuel's secret. They hadn't. They had only discovered the first page of a story that began long before Ashford Technologies officially existed. The boardroom stayed silent long after the file was closed. No one spoke. No one moved. Victor finally looked at Margaret. "So, what exactly are we dealing with?" Margaret answered honestly. "I don't know. But I know this wasn't an accident." She turned toward David. "I want everything. Every record from the company's first year. Every contract. Every board meeting. If Samuel's name appears anywhere, I want to see it." David nodded and left the room. Victor walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "This is ridiculous. We're letting an old maintenance worker distract us from running a company." Margaret looked at him. "Victor, the founder personally signed his hiring papers. That alone should concern you." Before Victor could answer, David returned. He was carrying something neither of them had expected. An old cardboard archive box. Dust covered every side. The tape had turned yellow with age. "I found this in the basement records room. The label says." He looked down. "Pre-incorporation documents." Margaret frowned. "I've never heard of that file." "Neither have I." David carefully opened the box. Inside were dozens of handwritten notebooks, old engineering sketches, receipts, photographs. Everything looked older than the company itself. Victor picked up one faded photograph. It showed 6 young people standing inside what looked like an abandoned warehouse. There were no computers, no expensive equipment, just folding tables, extension cords, and hope. David turned the photograph over. Someone had written a date, September 3rd, 36 years ago. Below it, another sentence. "The first day we believed this might actually work." Margaret smiled faintly. "Our founder always carried a camera." David reached deeper into the box. "This might interest you." He placed a worn leather notebook on the table. The first page carried the founder's name. Every page after that was handwritten. Ideas, calculations, daily notes. The early days of the company. Margaret slowly turned the pages. The entries described impossible deadlines, equipment that constantly broke, investors who refused to believe in them, weeks when no one took a paycheck. The company had nearly failed more than once. Then she reached an entry that made her stop. The date was exactly 1 week before the company officially opened. She began reading aloud. "Today, Samuel solved the server failure." Victor looked up. "Samuel," she continued. "Without him, we'd have lost everything." Another page. "The engineers have gone home. Samuel is still here. He's been awake for 31 hours. Another page. "He mortgaged his own house today so we could pay everyone's salaries." The room became very quiet. Victor slowly sat down. "That's impossible." David didn't answer. Instead, he found another photograph. This one showed the founder standing beside a younger man. Both were covered in grease. Both were laughing. Margaret studied the younger man's face. Then she looked toward Samuel's employee file. Then back at the photograph. Her voice became almost a whisper. "It's him." Victor leaned closer. "The janitor?" Margaret nodded. 35 years younger. Nobody spoke. 4 years they'd walked past Samuel without giving him a second thought. Yet the photographs told a completely different story. He wasn't standing in the background. He stood beside the founder in nearly every picture, helping install equipment, repairing machinery, training new employees, building the company long before anyone else believed it would succeed. Victor looked confused. If he did all that, why become a janitor? No one had an answer. David turned another page in the notebook. A folded envelope slipped onto the table. Across the front, in the founder's handwriting, were 6 words. Open only if Samuel ever leaves. Every eye in the room fixed on the envelope. No one reached for it. Because suddenly, opening it felt less like reading a letter, and more like opening a door that had been locked for decades. The board believed the envelope would explain Samuel's past. Instead, it revealed the one promise the founder had made that would change the company's future forever. David picked up the envelope. For a brief moment, no one in the room breathed. The paper had yellowed with age. The seal had never been broken. Across the front, the founder's handwriting was unmistakable. Open only if Samuel ever leaves. Margaret nodded. Go ahead. David carefully opened it and unfolded the letter. He cleared his throat. Then he began reading. If this letter has been opened, Samuel Brooks is no longer working inside this building. That means one of 2 things. Either he finally chose to retire, or someone made the biggest mistake this company has ever seen. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. David continued. Before you judge Samuel by the uniform he wears, remember this. Titles tell you what someone does. Character tells you who they are. The room was completely silent. Most people believe I founded Ashford Technologies. That isn't entirely true. Victor leaned forward. Margaret folded her arms. David turned the page. I had the vision. Samuel made it possible. When investors walked away, he mortgaged his house. When our servers failed, he rebuilt them. When our engineers quit, he worked beside me until sunrise. More than once, he kept this company alive while I received the credit. Victor slowly lowered his eyes. David continued reading. One evening, I offered Samuel a position as Chief Operating Officer. He refused. I offered him company shares. He refused those as well. He asked for only one thing. Margaret looked surprised. What did he ask for? David turned the page. He said, promise me this company will never forget why it exists. Treat people fairly. Protect those who build it. And never let power become more important than purpose. David stopped reading for a moment. His voice had become quieter. There are 2 pages left. Victor nodded. Keep going. Because Samuel never wanted ownership. I created something else. David picked up the envelope. For a brief moment, no one in the room breathed. The paper had yellowed with age. The seal had never been broken. Across the front, the founder's handwriting was unmistakable. Open only if Samuel ever leaves. Margaret nodded. Go ahead. David carefully opened it and unfolded the letter. He cleared his throat. Then he began reading. If this letter has been opened, Samuel Brooks is no longer working inside this building. That means one of 2 things. Either he finally chose to retire, or someone made the biggest mistake this company has ever seen. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. David continued. Before you judge Samuel by the uniform he wears, remember this. Titles tell you what someone does. Character tells you who they are. The room was completely silent. Most people believe I founded Ashford Technologies. That isn't entirely true. Victor leaned forward. Margaret folded her arms. David turned the page. I had the vision. Samuel made it possible. When investors walked away, he mortgaged his house. When our servers failed, he rebuilt them. When our engineers quit, he worked beside me until sunrise. More than once, he kept this company alive while I received the credit. Victor slowly lowered his eyes. David continued reading. One evening, I offered Samuel a position as Chief Operating Officer. He refused. I offered him company shares. He refused those as well. He asked for only one thing. Margaret looked surprised. What did he ask for? David turned the page. He said, promise me this company will never forget why it exists. Treat people fairly. Protect those who build it. And never let power become more important than purpose. David stopped reading for a moment. His voice had become quieter. There are 2 pages left. Victor nodded. Keep going. Because Samuel never wanted ownership. I created something else. A safeguard. Victor frowned. A safeguard. David read the next sentence. Every major decision affecting the company's original technology, founding principles and corporate charter requires the approval of one independent guardian. Margaret looked directly at Victor. Her expression had changed completely. David finished the paragraph. That guardian is Samuel Brooks. Nobody spoke. Victor finally broke the silence. That's impossible. David shook his head. It isn't. The legal language is attached. He removed another document from the envelope. Every signature had been notarized. Every page carried official corporate seals. Margaret scanned the final paragraph. Then she looked up. The agreement is still valid. Victor stood so quickly his chair nearly fell over. You're telling me a janitor can overrule this board? Margaret answered calmly. I'm telling you. He isn't just a janitor. Legally. He is the independent guardian of everything this company was built on. Victor paced across the room. This has to be outdated. We'll challenge it. David slowly shook his head. You can't. The agreement was written into the company's original incorporation documents. It has survived every merger, every restructuring, every amendment. Victor stopped walking. For the first time since becoming CEO, he looked afraid. Just then the conference room phone rang. Margaret answered. It was the head of legal affairs. Her expression changed as she listened. When she finally hung up, nobody had to ask, "What happened?" Victor said. Margaret took a slow breath. The merger paperwork. What about it? The investors have suspended it. Why? They've reviewed the original charter. And she looked directly at Victor. They won't sign a single document until Samuel Brooks gives his approval. The room fell into complete silence. The man they had escorted out with a cardboard box now held the one signature worth more than every executive sitting at that table. Victor had spent years believing power came with the corner office. He was about to learn the truth. The quiet old janitor wasn't interested in controlling the company. He was about to judge whether it deserved to survive at all. Victor Langley didn't leave the boardroom. He couldn't. For the first time since becoming CEO, he realized he wasn't the most powerful person in the company. He picked up the original charter again. There has to be a way around this. David looked at him. There isn't. We've reviewed every page. The agreement is legally binding. Victor slammed the folder shut. So you're telling me our entire merger depends on a man who spent the last 18 years pushing a mop? Margaret didn't even look up. No. It depends on the man who spent the first 18 years building this company. Victor had no answer. A few minutes later, his assistant rushed into the room. Sir, investors are asking questions. What questions? They've heard the merger has been delayed. Tell them we're reviewing paperwork. They already know it's more than paperwork. Victor frowned. How? The news leaked. Within an hour, financial reporters were calling the company's media office. Employees began whispering in hallways. No one knew the full story, but everyone knew something was wrong. Meanwhile, Samuel Brooks was sitting on the front porch of his small house. A cup of coffee rested beside him. The morning was quiet. For the first time in 18 years he had nowhere to be. His old work boots sat by the front door, still dusty from the day before. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring. A minute later, it rang again. Unknown number. He smiled and placed the phone back on the table. They finally found the charter, he said to himself. By afternoon, Victor had called 12 times. No answer. He sent emails. No reply. Finally, he turned to David. Go to his house. David hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? Because this isn't about finding Samuel. It's about convincing him. Victor grabbed his car keys. I'll do it myself. An hour later, a black sedan stopped outside Samuel's home. Victor stepped out and walked to the front porch. Samuel looked up from his rocking chair. Good afternoon. Victor forced a smile. Mr. Brooks. Samuel nodded politely. I didn't expect to see you. Victor remained standing. I'd like to talk. Samuel pointed to the empty chair beside him. Then sit. Victor sat. For nearly 30 seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Victor broke the silence. I think there has been a misunderstanding. Samuel smiled gently. No, I don't think there has. Victor took a slow breath. If your feelings were hurt yesterday, this isn't about my feelings. Victor paused. We'd like you to come back. As a consultant, we're prepared to offer any salary you want. Samuel chuckled softly. You still don't understand. Victor frowned. What don't I understand? You think this is about money. It never was. Victor leaned forward. The merger will create thousands of jobs. It will increase profits. It will make this company stronger. Samuel looked across the quiet neighborhood before answering. When was the last time you walked through your own factory? Victor looked confused. I visit regularly. No. You visit meetings. I asked when you walked through the factory. When you stopped to thank the people working overtime. When you asked the receptionist how her husband was recovering. When you learned the name of the young engineer who missed his daughter's birthday to finish your deadline. Victor stayed silent. Samuel continued. You know every quarterly report. You know every profit margin. But you don't know your people. And that's why you're here. Victor looked away. For the first time, someone had spoken to him without fear, without trying to impress him, without asking for anything. Samuel slowly stood. You want my signature? Yes. I'll consider it. Relief washed across Victor's face. But Samuel's voice became firm. Not until I know whether this company still deserves it. Victor's smile disappeared. What does that mean? It means I'm not evaluating a merger. I'm evaluating your leadership. Victor stared at him. Samuel opened his front door. You'll hear from me. The conversation was over. Victor drove away believing he still had a chance. He didn't notice the woman watering flowers across the street, or the delivery driver sitting in his truck, or the retired engineer walking his dog. Every one of them had watched the CEO arrive. Every one of them recognized Samuel. And before sunset, the entire town was talking, not about the merger, not about the board, but about one simple question. Why would the CEO beg an old janitor to come back? Victor thought convincing Samuel would be the hardest part. He was wrong. The next morning, dozens of former employees began showing up at Samuel's house. Each of them carried the same thing, a story that had never been told. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Samuel's front porch wasn't empty anymore. A retired machinist stood at the gate. Behind him was a woman carrying a small paper bag. Then another man arrived. Then another. By 9 o'clock, more than 20 people had gathered outside Samuel's home. None of them worked at Ashford Technologies anymore. Some had retired years ago. Others had resigned. A few had been laid off. Yet every one of them had come for the same reason: to stand beside the man who had once stood beside them. Samuel stepped onto the porch. He smiled. I wasn't expecting company. An elderly woman walked forward first. Her name was Helen Carter. She had worked in payroll for almost 30 years. She held out the paper bag. I baked these this morning. Samuel laughed softly. You still remember my favorite cookies. You remembered my birthday every year. I figured it was my turn. Samuel accepted the bag with both hands. Thank you. One by one the others stepped forward. Not with gifts. With memories. A former maintenance supervisor smiled. Do you remember my first week? Samuel nodded. You almost drove a forklift through the loading dock. The group laughed. I was ready to quit. The man looked down. But you stayed 3 hours after work. You taught me everything. I ended up working here for 27 years. Another woman spoke. When my husband was diagnosed with cancer, I couldn't afford to take unpaid leave. I never found out who covered my shifts. She looked at Samuel. Until years later. Samuel shook his head. You needed the time. That's all that mattered. A younger man stepped forward. I was an apprentice. My father had just passed away. I couldn't focus. Everyone thought I was lazy. He smiled sadly. You sat with me during every lunch break for a month. You never talked about work. You just listened. I stayed because of you. Oh. Samuel looked uncomfortable. I didn't do anything special. The young man smiled. You never realized that, did you? Across the street, reporters had started arriving. The story about the mysterious janitor had spread overnight. Television cameras pointed toward the house. But nobody inside the small crowd paid them any attention. This wasn't for the news. This was personal. Back at Ashford Technologies, Victor watched the live coverage from his office. The screen showed dozens of former employees standing outside Samuel's home. His assistant looked confused. I don't understand. They don't even work here anymore. Victor didn't answer. Because he was asking himself the same question. Why would people who had already moved on come back for one retired janitor? Just then Margaret walked into his office. You need to see this. She handed him a folder. What is it? Exit interviews. Victor flipped through the pages. Hundreds of them. Employees who had resigned over the past 10 years. He skimmed the first few. The company doesn't feel the same anymore. Another. Leadership stopped listening. Another. People are treated like numbers. Another. Samuel was the only reason I stayed as long as I did. Victor stopped reading. He looked at Margaret. How many of these mention Samuel? Margaret answered quietly. I counted this morning. She paused. 112. Victor stared at her. That's impossible. No. It's something we never bothered to notice. 4 years performance reports measured productivity, revenue, growth, efficiency, but no report had ever measured something far more valuable. Trust. Victor closed the folder. For the first time, he realized the company hadn't started losing people after the layoffs. It had been losing them, one disappointed employee at a time. That afternoon, David called Samuel. This time, Samuel answered. Good afternoon, David. I was hoping you'd pick up. I thought it was time. David hesitated. The board would like to meet with you. Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he said something David wasn't expecting. I'll meet with the board. But not at headquarters. Where would you like to meet? Samuel looked at the old work boots sitting beside his front door. Then he smiled. The first warehouse. The place where this company actually began. David's heart skipped a beat. The first warehouse had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. Almost no one even remembered it existed. Samuel did. Because some places never stop feeling like home. The board thought they were walking into an ordinary meeting. Instead, they were about to unlock a building that had been sealed for 3 decades. What they found inside would change everything they believed about Ashford Technologies. Near the entrance, visitors stopped in front of a bronze plaque. It carried a single sentence from the original charter. A company survives because of its people. The day profit becomes more valuable than character, the company begins to die. Years later, when visitors asked who Samuel Brooks was, the guides never called him the founder. They never called him the guardian. They simply smiled and answered. He reminded everyone what leadership was supposed to look like. Samuel never asked to have a statue. He never wanted his name on the building. He never cared about recognition, because he had learned something long before anyone else. Buildings grow old. Companies change. Titles disappear. But every act of kindness, every lesson shared, every person lifted when they were struggling, lives on in someone else. That is a legacy no one can fire, no one can erase, and no one can ever take away. He wasn't thinking like a CEO. He was thinking like a man who had failed. I can do that, he said quietly. Samuel studied his face. No, you can promise that. What matters is whether you actually do it. A week later, every employee at Ashford Technologies received an invitation. Attendance was mandatory. People expected another corporate announcement. Instead, they found the auditorium transformed into something resembling a museum. Old photographs covered the walls, original engineering sketches, handwritten notes, the worn leather notebook. Even the old wooden table from the warehouse stood at the front of the stage. Each carved name had been carefully restored. Victor walked onto the stage alone. He looked out at hundreds of employees. There were no polished speeches, no carefully rehearsed corporate language. I owe every one of you an apology. The room became silent. I believed success was measured by quarterly reports. I believed leadership came with a title. I was wrong. The strongest foundation this company ever had wasn't technology. It wasn't money. It wasn't me. He turned toward Samuel, who was sitting quietly in the front row. It was people who chose to build something bigger than themselves. The audience stood and applauded, not because Samuel had become famous, not because he had won, but because they finally understood. Respect isn't created by a job title. It's earned one decision at a time. 6 months later, the merger moved forward, not because Samuel approved it immediately, because the company first proved it had changed. The employees who wanted to return came back. New leadership programs were introduced. Every executive spent time working alongside frontline employees. The old warehouse was restored and reopened, not as an office, but as a museum dedicated to the people who built Ashford Technologies. No one spoke for several moments. The silence inside the old warehouse felt heavier than any argument. Victor looked at Samuel. What happens now? Samuel rested the leather binder on the wooden table. That depends. On what? On whether you're willing to fix what you broke. Victor straightened his shoulders. If this is about money, name the amount. Samuel smiled. After all these years, Victor still didn't understand. It has never been about money. He opened the original charter one last time. Then he looked around the room. I have 3 conditions. The directors listened carefully. First, every employee who lost their job during the recent layoffs will receive an offer to return. No exceptions. Victor immediately objected. Some positions have already been eliminated. Samuel calmly replied. Then create new ones. The company found room to remove them. It can find room to bring them back. No one argued. Samuel continued. Second, I want every employee from the newest intern to the chief executive officer to spend 1 full day each year working beside the maintenance, warehouse, and customer service teams. Victor frowned. What difference will that make? Samuel looked him in the eye. You can't respect work you've never done. And you can't lead people you refuse to understand. Margaret slowly nodded. I like that. Samuel looked at Victor again. My 3rd condition is the most important. The room became perfectly still. I don't want a promotion. I don't want company shares. I don't want an office. Victor looked confused. Then what do you want? Samuel took a slow breath. I want the truth. The entire truth. I want every employee to know how this company was built. He gently touched the old wooden table. Not so they remember me. So they never forget the people whose names history ignored. Victor lowered his head. For the first time, the voice on the other end spoke quickly. David slowly lowered the phone. He looked directly at Victor. Our biggest investor. They've officially withdrawn from the merger. Victor felt his stomach drop. Why? David took a slow breath. They said they no longer trust the leadership of this company. The warehouse fell silent. For years, Victor believed trust was something that automatically came with success. Now, he was watching millions of dollars disappear because it had been lost. Samuel quietly picked up the old binder. There was never anything magical about this charter. Everyone looked at him. The paper didn't protect this company. The people did. The board expected Samuel to save Ashford Technologies. Instead, he made 3 conditions. Not for himself. For every employee who had ever believed this company could be better. And 1 condition would force Victor to make the hardest decision of his career. Samuel smiled when he saw the picture. That was our rule. Victor quietly looked away. Samuel walked toward an old wooden table in the corner. A thick layer of dust covered it. He gently wiped the surface clean with his hand. Beneath the dust, letters had been carved into the wood. Dozens of names. Some deep, some barely visible. What are these? Victor asked. Our first employees. Samuel ran his fingers across the carved names. Whenever someone finished their first year, they carved their name into this table. Margaret noticed something else. Near the center, 1 name had been carved larger than the others. The founders. Directly beside it, Samuel's. The 2 names touched, almost as if they'd been carved together. David looked around the room. This place should have been preserved. Samuel smiled. It wasn't the building that mattered. It was what happened inside it. He walked toward an old metal cabinet. After unlocking it, he removed a worn leather binder. Victor immediately recognized it. The original charter. Samuel nodded. The real one. He placed it on the table. Everyone gathered around. Samuel slowly opened the first page. Inside were signatures, founding principles, handwritten notes. Then he turned to a page none of them had seen before. Across the top was a sentence written by the founder. A company survives because of its people. The day profit becomes more valuable than character, the company begins to die. No one spoke. Samuel looked directly at Victor. When was the last time you asked yourself why this company exists? Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Samuel closed the binder. You've spent years trying to make Ashford bigger. But you stopped making it better. The words landed harder than any accusation. Because deep down, Victor knew they were true. Just then David's phone rang. He answered. His expression changed immediately. What happened? The first warehouse sat at the edge of town. Most people drove past it without a second glance. The faded brick walls were stained by time. The old company sign had long since fallen away. Broken windows looked out over an empty parking lot, where weeds had grown through the cracked pavement. 36 years earlier, this forgotten building had been the birthplace of Ashford Technologies. Now it looked like history itself had been abandoned. One by one, black sedans pulled into the lot. Victor arrived first. Then Margaret. David. The remaining board members followed. No one spoke as they stepped out of their cars. Samuel was already there. He stood beside the old entrance wearing the same blue work jacket he'd worn for years. In one hand, he held a small brass key. Victor looked around. I didn't even know this place still belonged to the company. Samuel smiled. Most people don't. He unlocked the heavy steel door. The hinges groaned as it slowly opened. A layer of dust covered everything inside. Old workbenches, rusted shelves, wooden desks. It looked as though everyone had walked out one evening and never returned. Samuel stepped inside. Welcome home. The board followed him through the warehouse. Victor looked around in disbelief. This is where it all started. Samuel nodded. There were 7 of us. 1 engineer, 1 accountant, 1 salesman, the founder, and 3 people who simply refused to quit. Margaret noticed framed photographs hanging along one wall. Every picture showed exhausted people smiling beside unfinished machines. Nobody wore expensive suits. Nobody had private offices. Everyone worked wherever they were needed. She stopped in front of one photograph. It showed Samuel standing on a ladder, installing electrical wiring. The founder stood below him holding a flashlight. Across the bottom, someone had written, "If one of us works late, all of us work late."